that's part of the rush to get the Nazi scientists, is to get the ones who are like that deep, this deep on like really exotic, flight principles and UFO stuff. We now know Hans Kammler himself, who was in charge of the blackest of the black Wunderwaffe programs for the Nazis, made his way to the US. So rumors are that you have this Magenta crash, and then Mussolini goes to Hitler and says, "Is this yours?" to the Nazis.
Right.
And then they end up working together on it. Vannevar Bush would be heading it up.
And then, of course, Vannevar Bush is completely unconnected with Robert Sarbacher and Dr. Eric A. Walker, as also mentioned as the head of UFO
and those guys,
research.
That's right.
It kind of seems like around 86, the Majestic 12 took on a new name, the UFO Working Group, and got new blood, like Albert Stubblebine and some NSA people and some CIA people.
What is the core story of Zodiac? Like, what is...
It's essentially the Majestic 12 by another name. Because the Majestic 12, for people who don't know, was introduced under... The Majestic 12 documents first appeared in 1984 in a film canister to to TV producer Jamie Chandere. And this included the Eisenhower briefing document and later the Special Operations Manual, and then a whole host of other documents. And this details the Majestic 12 as supposed UFO crash retrieval and reverse engineering group, spearheaded by Vannevar Bush, including including Roscoe Hillenkoetter, Dr. Donald Menzel, I think his name is, von Neumann,
Jerome Hunsaker, who else?
Denzel Ward,
Vandenberg,
Hoyt
Vandenberg, Nathan Twining, a bunch of head honchos in military intelligence science.
And so, Majestic 12, Zodiac 12 signs. Some might suggest in the realm of UFO study that Zodiac is another name for Majestic 12, just like Majestic 12 has been called other names like the Working Group, the PI-40 by that guy AH we talked about with Greer. So it's a super interesting story that I hope sees more coverage, because Richard Dolan has been a true trailblazer in the Zodiac story, and it's just kind of like the secret retrieval team. So to be quite plain, after talking with Ryan Wood, I think the Majestic 12 did exist in a capacity and probably still exists today, but I am hesitant to think about like a very ubiquitous crash retrieval team. I think that there's a very wide swath of retrieval teams and retrieval operations.
Well, there are people who I think are pretty credible who talk about this, like these continuity of government programs.
Yeah.
So the 5412 committee, national security, committee, back in the 50s and 60s, that turned into the 303 committee, which turned into the committee of 40. Do you have anything to say about that as far as their kind of, interest in UFOs?
Only thing I know is that Colonel John B. Alexander said that the Majestic 12 was specifically a continuity of government program.
Right.
But I hasten to adhere to what he says, because he lied about the Special Operations Manual.
He lied about a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
And even in the Wilson memo, where the Wilson, of course, the Wilson
absolutely.
memo. So this was it 1997?
1997 was when the Greer, Will Miller, Thomas Wilson, Stephen Lufkin meeting took place. The briefing took place.
Okay, interesting. But when was, and then
2002.
2002 is this meeting between Eric Davis, who's again this Hal Puthoff protege, propulsions expert, and like exotic physics expert. It's in the parking lot of EG&G, and he's meeting with Admiral Thomas Wilson, who's head of Joint Chiefs J2. He
was like intelligence for JCS at the time.
So he should have like all exotic tech under his purview, and he's basically expressing extreme dissatisfaction that you had these rogue groups working on purportedly UFOs who he met with, and it's out of his jurisdiction. And in that document that I believe was found in the Edgar Mitchell estate, in that document, it says J.A. is a liar. And I think J.A. is John Alexander.
Yeah. Because John Alexander has been publicly said, Majestic 12 exists. It had nothing to do with UFOs, and kind of all of that before. And of course, he kind of said mistruths about what Dr. Ryan Wood said about the Special Operations Manual. Ryan Wood and Robert Wood did a ton of provenance research on the Majestic documents, getting the physical onion skin documents, putting them through rigorous testing of materials.
So what do you think about these documents? Because they're popular view, like with those kind of old school like UFO researchers like Robert Hastings, who wrote UFOs and Nukes, is that this was passage material. So it was like meant to detect spies. It contained all sorts of falsities. You're giving it to this film producer who's friends with all these UFO researchers, Jamie Chandera. And then I think other versions of the Majestic 12 were then doled out in packages to other UFO
Yeah,
researchers.
because there's a whole host of documents, and the source cannot be all from the same person, and a bunch of varying quality documents. I tend to adhere to the work of Stanton Friedman, who spent a bunch of time authenticating these Special Operations Manual and Eisenhower briefing document with the Woods. I think those two probably have the strongest claims of real documents, as well as the two IPU, Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit reports. One of them is a 7-page report that sounds very similar to the Eisenhower briefing document and talks about the Roswell crash retrieval and so forth. Later on down the line, you get a lot of other documents like the burned memo and the Project Aquarius document from Lee Graham. The burned memo or the Project Aquarius, one of them, I can't remember which, actually makes reference to Project Zodiac, by the way, and like Project Jehovah and MK Ultra. But a lot of the earlier documents, like the Eisenhower briefing document, a lot of the dates and specific discussions line up with real events. For example, James Forrestal meeting with Truman, dates are mentioned when those two met and kind of discussed the future or the inception of Majestic 12 and so forth. If you look in the Library of Truman, library of Eisenhower, when he supposedly briefed these presidents and president incumbents,
I
had
believe
these
Dulles'
meetings.
diary recently came out, and it showed a meeting with him and Eisenhower or something, and that was like a real meeting. And his diary came out after the Majestic 12 documents obviously had come out, and they corroborated the information in the Majestic 12 documents. So it's probably similar to the Lazar stuff, where it's like some of the stuff is just true. Well, and then maybe true and under a different name, and maybe they were looking for spies and there was some passage material involved. But yeah, it is interesting.
And then there were other documents like the Cutler Twining memo that is really difficult to dispute and so forth. I was actually reading on the plane over here different validation of Majestic documents, and there's just been a lot of mentions of Majestic documents before, even including I can't remember the general's name, but a 4-star general who was asked about the documents. He said they're real, or the Majestic 12 is real. I can't tell you any more than that, because I know that the Majestic 12 to many sort of hobbyists in this subject is nothing more than kind of conspiracy material, right? They just think Majestic 12 may, not true.
But if you were to simulate back then, if a UFO issue were a thing and we had exotic materials and we were in contact with, an extraterrestrial or interdimensional intelligence, you would need our best and brightest on it. Yeah. And if you look at that list of people, those would be the people on it. Yeah. Vannevar Bush would be heading it up.
And then, of course, Vannevar Bush is completely unconnected with Robert Sarbacher and Dr. Eric A. Walker, as also mentioned as the head of UFO
and those guys,
research.
That's right. And then you have Gordon Gray, who was also on the Majestic. Don Menzel, who admitted, he was super read in on a Navy, CIA, a bunch of, pretty classified info, and admitted as much actually to Kennedy. And Stanton Friedman actually writes about this, was sort of in charge of disinfo and debunking, which he was debunking a lot of. And there's this amazing Swedish astronomer, Beatrice Villarreal, and she talks about Menzel having deleted all this astronomical information from 1953 and onwards from the Harvard Observatory. Yeah. And at the Harvard Undersea Observatory at the time, you had Robert Sarbacher. He was working there. And then I think James Conant was the president of Harvard, and he was the number 2 guy, the Manhattan Project at the time. So yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say, but it sort of makes sense. It's directionally correct.
Yeah. And it's not unreasonable to think that the group evolved over time, changed names and so forth. I mean, you have in 1987 or 86 or 87, when Eric Walker is asked by Steinman about the Majestic 12, and he gives the Don Quixote impersonation. You're chasing after windmills. It's impossible to chase after the Majestic 12. The Majestic documents were first delivered to Chandray and Friedman and so forth in 1984. That's when the first documents were actually kind of received, but weren't given to a MUFON symposium until 87. What's interesting is the documents were kind of mailed out in 84. And then if we look at the manuscript of Corso, it kind of seems like around 86, the Majestic 12 took on a new name, the UFO Working Group, and got new blood, like Albert Stubblebine and some NSA people and some CIA people. It's interesting to think how this group may have evolved over time, and possibly it changed its name to the Working Group because it was aware of the leaks at the time.
The whole history is fascinating. I think maybe, one of the tip of the spear frontier longitudinal timeline assessments of all UFO oversight is this great article by Chris Sharp at the Liberation Times.
Oh yeah.
It's really interesting stuff. And there's some connections you've made between Woods Hole and like, some of the, Crane
and
exactly.
SAIC,
And Randy Anderson's story. But I also just want to touch on, he talks about how it was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was before the National Security Act, before the CIA, was formed. They were sort of in charge of the initial UFO, custody. And I think we have a decent map of actually what occurred. So David Grush says that there's this Magenta crash in Lombardy in Italy in 1933. Exactly. I've now made the connection through some people. This woman, Pippa Malmgren, who's amazing. She's really interested in the UFO thing, but she was actually special assistant to George W. Bush. She made it clear to me that James Jesus Angleton was the U.S. OSS person involved in Italy at the time. And so rumors are that you have this Magenta crash, and then Mussolini goes to Hitler and says, "Is this yours?" to the Nazis.
Right.
And then they end up working together on it. So this Magenta crash ends up probably being worked on by the Nazis, which explains these Die Glocke, rumors and Kamlerstab in sort of modern Czechoslovakia and Poland, where they're working on these flying saucers. You have tons of reports around this from Rudolf Schreiber, Richard Mita, a bunch of guys at the time, along with Paul Mellon and Alan Dulles. There's a story of Paul Mellon kind of spilling the beans to his, grandson who's alive now, John Warner IV, about sitting, standing over a UFO that can employ exotic flight principles in modern day Czechoslovakia.
Wow.
And so you kind of can come up with this thread of the Lombardy Magenta crash happens. It goes to the Nazis. Maybe there's some custody where the Vatican is involved as well.
I've heard that from Grush.
I heard that from Grush. And then it goes over to the US, and then it's worked on at Wright Airfield. And you have all these Operation Overcast paperclip Nazi scientists who then, that's part of the rush to get the Nazi scientists, is to get the ones who are this deep on really exotic, flight principles and UFO stuff. We now know Hans Kammler himself, who's in charge of the blackest of the black Wunderwaffe programs for the Nazis, made his way to the US. And so you kind of have this somewhat consistent narrative of what happened with this early UFO crash and how the US started to get involved with this stuff. And all the guys who were involved in the early Marshall Plan and tech transfer programs, Kissinger was an Army counter-intel guy who was doing tech retrieval at the time. And you have other examples. You mentioned Forrestal. Forrestal, was as well, and he was Secretary of the Navy. So
he threw himself out of the Naval Hospital in Bethesda.
Yeah, exactly. Mid Sophocles poem.
And the Magenta case is so interesting because Mussolini thought it was a Nazi advanced craft or a British or American advanced craft when he had his own special investigation group, the RS-33, who was really keen on the fact this wasn't human technology, and then likely worked with the Nazis.